Until now, we have not worried too much about security, but we all know that security is important. In this chapter, we are going to learn how to manage security in SQL Server. This is it, our last module. Our objectives in this module are to know how to create new users and grant them permissions using code or SQL Server Management Studio. Also, how to create database roles and server roles using code. Also, how to create database roles and server roles using SQL Server Management Studio. Also, how to add users to roles. We will also cover the two different authentication modes, as well as cover some terminology. Let's cover login IDs. This slide illustrates how a user gains access to a SQL Server database. Typically, a network user must log on to the network using a login ID and password. If the client uses Windows, SQL Server can use the Windows login ID defined for the user. Otherwise, you can create a separate SQL Server login ID. Permissions determine the actions a user can take on a database object. On all the objects in a schema, on a database, or on a server. A role is a collection of permissions that you can assign to a user by assigning the user to that role. You can create a collection of users in a Windows called a group. Then you can assign permissions and roles either to individual users or to a group of users. The users, groups, logins, and roles are called principals. The entities that can be secured on a server, including the server itself, are called securables. Here is some important terminology. Permissions determine the actions a user can take. A role is a collection of permissions. A group is a collection of users. You can assign permissions and roles either to individual users or to a group of users. The users, groups, logins, and roles are called principals. The entities that can be secured on a server, including the server itself, are called securables. There are two ways to configure security. If you need to set up a new system with many users, it is easier to code SQL scripts. The Management Studio is better for making changes to an existing system or for setting up a small system. We're going to learn both techniques. To define the authentication mode, you right-click on the server, and then Properties, and then Security. So we right-click on the server name, select Properties, and then Security. The default setting for SQL Server is Windows Authentication Mode. If users are accessing the database from a Windows machine, this is what you want because users will only have to log in once. If you specify SQL Server in Windows Authentication Mode, users will have to log in twice. And this slide just repeats what I just said. To create a new SQL Server login ID, you must specify a login name and a password. There are also some other options you can specify. Default database and default language are self-explanatory. Check expiration reminds users to change passwords. Check policy enforces password policies. Must change forces the user to change passwords when they first log on. Usually, you'll just leave these options at their defaults. When you install SQL Server, it is configured with some built-in IDs. To add additional IDs, you can use the create login statement. In this example, we are creating a login for the Windows user named Susan Roberts in the Windows domain named Accounting. If you are working with SQL Server Express on your own system, the domain name is just the name of your computer. And here's the new login from a Windows account. And here's a new SQL Server login ID with the default database of AP. A common task you can perform is to change the password for a SQL Server login ID. You can change the password without specifying the old password. You can also force the user to enter a new password the next time the login is used by coding the must change option. This statement changes the password for a SQL Server login ID and this statement disables a Windows login ID. I'm sorry, I highlighted the wrong one. So this statement changes the password. This statement disables the password. And this statement deletes the SQL Server login ID. Each database maintains a list of the users that are authorized to access the database. This list is distinct from the list of login IDs that is maintained by the server. So this is important. To provision a user, you need to create a login and create a user. This script creates a database user with the same name as a login ID. The password you specify for a SQL Server login should be a strong password. Here are some guidelines. Tables, views, functions, and procedures of a database are stored in schemas. One advantage of using schemas is that you can grant permissions to all the objects in a schema by granting permissions to the schema. This statement assigns a default schema to a user. You can use the create schema statement to create a schema in the current database. You can also create tables and views within the new schema. This creates a schema called accounting. And this creates a schema called marketing and a table within that schema. This transfers a schema or a table from one schema to another. And these statements delete schemas. You can use this grant statement format to give a user permission to work with the database object. The object name argument specifies the object for which the permission is being granted or revoked and can specify a table, a stored procedure, or a user-defined function. You can also list the columns for which permissions are granted. The database principal argument in the to clause can be the name of a database user or a user-defined role. This slide lists the specific object permissions that you can code in either the grant or revoke statements. You can only grant permissions that are appropriate for the object or schema. Here we are granting different permissions to a user named John Doe. We can also grant permission to execute a stored procedure. We can also grant select permission to specific columns. And we can also grant permission to alter a table. If a system has many users, granting and revoking permissions one by one would require a lot of coding. To help reduce the amount of coding, and to help you keep your database security organized, you can use roles. A role is a collection of permissions. When you assign a user to a particular role, you grant them all of the permissions associated with that role. SQL Server supports two different types of roles, fixed roles and user-defined roles. Here are some of the available fixed server roles. These roles typically include users who manage the server. You do not modify the permissions, you just add or revoke users to the roles. SQL Server also provides a public server role. This role has a default permission of view any database, and each login is automatically assigned to this role. Here is a list of the fixed database roles. These roles are added to each database you create. You can add and delete members from these roles, but you cannot delete the roles. SQL Server also provides a public database role. Any user that's not given specific permissions on a securable is given the permissions assigned to the public role. The steps for using a role are: create the role, grant permissions to the role, and alter role, add members to the role. The following examples show the syntax for working with roles. Remember that there are fixed server roles, fixed database roles, and user-defined roles. The first two statements add and drop a user to a fixed database role or fixed server role. These statements add and drop a user to a fixed database role. And here are some system stored procedures that can help you manage this. SP help serve role, SP help serve role member, and SP help role. You use the create role statement to create a user-defined database role. Once you create a database role, you can grant permissions to or revoke permissions from the role. When you do that, you are granting or revoking permission for every member of that role. So in the following example, we are doing a few things. First, I'm going to do a little cleanup. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a role called invoice entry. Second, we are granting insert and update permissions on the invoices table to the role we just created and the invoice line items table. Third, we are assigning members to the role by using the alter role, add member statement. Well, it looks like I hadn't actually created the user John Doe. Let's see if I can get it to work now. Good. So again, we have created the role, granted the privileges to the role, and then added members to the role. It is also possible to assign a role as a member of another role. Be careful if you do this because it can be really hard to keep track of who has access to what. We can also change the name of the new role. And we can see that we actually added John Doe to this role that we just created. Okay, we'll cover the rest of this subject matter in some other videos.